this thing moved about 6 feet up in the air, straight up and down. And there wasn't a living soul in the bathroom with me apart from myself, and I was 6 feet away from the brush. Now, this was the most startling thing that could have happened to me, because I thought at that time that all there was in physics, I thought I was the last word in physics. I was quite good at this kind of thing, and I had nothing to kind of explain this in any quantum terms either. And I wondered what on earth this thing was, what actually happened. And I actually saw this, and there's no one on this earth going to tell me it didn't happen, it was a dream, or I was on drugs or drunk, and I was perfectly normal at the time. And of course, this made me think quite a bit about what might be there, more things in heaven and earth than I dreamt of in our philosophy. But the thing that connected this to my friend, and this is where it becomes relevant to my Swiss friend, was that as soon as I saw this, I got the distinct smell, very strongly, of an aftershave only he used to wear. And in fact, I used to identify him coming into the house by this smell of his, and that was the thing that made me immediately associate this, perhaps, with what we discussed all those years previously. And I wondered, is this possible? Now, I'm a pretty hard-bitten guy when it comes to evidence of any sort. And, it stayed with me all my life, and I kind of, contemplated this. And I've come to the conclusion that maybe this was a genuine experience, and of course that then led me on to opening the doors, so to speak, a little bit more in my psychology to looking at things such as this. And then, if I may move over to my experience directly of UFOs such as I have it, my son, 12-year-old son, Darren, is a very, very smart little fellow, and he came to me one day and said, "Look, Dad, are these UFO things, are they real? Are they actual in our reality, or is it some kind of motivational mechanism or something that is, in the mind or whatever?" And I was immediately driven as an intuition or as a response to say, "No, this is not real. This is nonsense, blah, blah. It's Mickey Mouse, Star Trekkers and all that kind of business and so forth." But I hesitated with Darren because he's a pretty clever fellow and he would have done the research. And if I was wrong, I would have been, embarrassed by him for sure. So I decided quietly, before I gave him the answer, finally, to have a look into these kinds of things. And not to any extent, of course, just drifted into it and looked at a little bit of the pros and cons of it and so forth. And I got more and more and more involved.
Well, if I just stop you there, was this at a time when you could, for instance, go onto the web and search there, or did you go to the library?
No. This was many, many years ago.
Right.
This was about 26 years ago, long before websites had arrived. At least it was commonplace, shall we say. So Darren was about 12 at the time. And it would have been about 28 years ago, really, basically, when that question was actually asked, and I was confronted at looking at this question of UFOs and all that kind of thing, And of course, I had no background in it. As I say, I had to start from scratch. I had to look at it, all the evidence, as best I could. And I had this science disposition, or the scientific methodology, kind of inculcated in my mind and by my family. And particularly my grandfather was a stickler for all these disciplines. And I set about this in a very methodological kind of fashion. And of course, as time went on, it became more and more apparent to me that I was dealing with something completely out of the kind of frame of reference with which I wanted to approach it. This was becoming absolutely incredible, and there were connections being made here that took me into areas that had nothing to do with UFOs, in fact. And of course, as time went on, we got deeper into it. The thing that actually made me take this business about external life forms and so on was when I spoke to the son of an Air Force general in the United States Air Force, who was another friend of mine. And when I spoke about this in conjunction with my research, I said, "Look, Nigel, let me tell you something. And I'm going to tell you something that my father told me on his deathbed." And he said, that this man, his father was a colonel at the time, I think, in the U.S. Air Force, colonel or major, I don't quite remember what. And apparently, his father told him that he was instrumental in actually taking out an alien kind of being, that was the way he described it, from one of these crashed discs, and that he was one of the people that actually lifted out these beings and put them where the research people in the United States wanted it done. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that this deathbed confession was what convinced him that this entire thing was absolutely true. And of course it made me think, of course, that this is, there was nothing that this boy had about him that told me that he would be a liar or whatever. Mm. And it turned out later on that I'd affirmed this anyway for myself, And this, therefore, set me on a completely different kind of tack, looking at this very, very seriously indeed. Mm. And that's how I came to I can't say it in a nutshell. I'm sorry, it's such a long-winded thing, Henrik, but that's how I came to research this whole business.
Well, there you go. There you have it. That's very interesting, though, and I think that all these things, just as you explained them, have slowly but surely led you onto this path, and now then you have two at this stage on this topic at least, two books behind you. Then the Song of the Grace, and then yes, the new book as well that we'll talk a little bit more later about. But I would like to ask if you could talk just briefly about the first book here as well, then, in terms of your main thesis, or take the time that you feel necessary to explain to our listeners as well. Basically, this idea that the Greys are a kind of sophisticated biological robots created by an extraterrestrial civilization. I've heard this a little bit here and there in various circles, but not very detailed, more like a brushed aside concept, an idea. But is there something in your research that suggests to you that this is really the case? This is the way it is in terms of the origins of the species in comparison, that they're actually from another planet and their own sentient beings and so forth. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, I take your point. Well, obviously this is a very important thing to try to figure out. What exactly are these things, and who are they, and what they are, and so forth. And how does one come at that? Obviously, they're not going to provide us with the physical evidence of this, and one has to look at anecdotal evidence of reliable sources, people with good pedigrees and so forth, that have no reason to go into hyperbole. And I'm sure a lot of people don't lie deliberately, but they do stretch a point from time to time. And with a thing as important as this, and obviously, all the time I'm thinking now about the future generations and my own children and whatever. Is this thing really true? Does it really hang up? And how ridiculous it must be for a person believing in, the tooth fairy and all the rest of it. I had all that business and so forth. And I really wanted to make sure that I backed up everything that I actually found about it with reliable evidence that could be verified. You see, I was meticulous about that. Now, arriving at what these things might be. Well, abductees, and all the many, many thousands of reports that I've read over the years about this phenomenon, these people who get taken by these beings and have these awful draconian experiences, they're obviously fascinating and so on. And I can't see that many of them are lying. I think that this is much too a very prevalent thing, and I look at them with sympathy now from that original, rather suspicious, shall we say, stance. Mm-hmm. I wanted to keep as fair a mind, Henrik, as possible when I was looking at this, and it's no good walking into any particular pathway because you feel you want it to be this or the other, because you wanted to tell, and I wanted to give my son Darren a really cogent answer that he could take into his son and future generations and so on.
Now, if only every parent did that when the child asked them a question, wouldn't the world be a different place then?
Well, Henrik, children, particularly of that kind of age, they are really sincere, and yes, and I don't believe that they want to beat around the bush. They really are. They really think about things much more deeply than we actually give a lot of these children credit for.
Absolutely.
And I have a great respect for young people, Anyway, this idea that these abductees came up with this constant reference to blank emotionless faces of these beings, that they carry out painful procedures on their human subjects, as they carry out their experimental procedures, many of which are centered on the reproductive system, the impression is that we tended to be a kind of laboratory rat to them, and that they were some kind of emotionless mechanism.